Have you been using Ubuntu 22.04 LTS and noticed a problem that made it seem like it's really unstable? With apps like Firefox, Chromium, Visual Studio Code, big IDEs like the JetBrains tools, memory-intensive games, and even the Gnome shell basically being killed out of nowhere with literally no warning, and all of the work you were doing in it is just completely gone. Well, if you have been experiencing that problem, then you're not the only one. Luckily though, the cause is known and a solution is being worked on. Now, I don't even really want to say the project this tool is involved with, because it's going to lead to more comments about how bad this entire project is, but this is a Systemd tool called Systemd OOMD, which from now on I'm going to refer to as Systemd OOMD because I think that is a funnier name. So Systemd OOMD is a user space out of memory killer. Basically think of it as like a generic garbage collector for Linux, not just desktop usage, but Linux usage in general. Basically, it's going to go around killing apps and processes that are not being used when you hit a certain memory threshold, so that instead of wasting your memory on things that are just not being used, you can actually use that memory. So in Ubuntu's case, by default, it's set to act when you're past 90% memory usage or 90% swap usage. Now, you might think an OOM is just a totally crazy thing to have on Linux. How dare there be this program that is going around killing things on my system? But Systemd OOMD is not the first OOM. You have things like early OOM, you have NoHang, and plenty of other projects that have been doing this for years, really. And there is even an OOM built directly into the kernel. The only difference with this is rather than it being in the kernel side, it operates in the user space, so it knows about things like applications, not just individual processes. Relying strictly on the kernel OOM is probably fine in like a web server context, but in a Linux desktop usage, it can hang sometimes, and that can be a serious problem when you're actually, actively using the system. Now, an OOM is mainly a concern on a low memory system, which nowadays is 8 gigs or less. You might say 8 gigs is a crazy amount of memory, but when we're talking about something that runs Gnome, 8 gigs is totally reasonable. If you have a high memory system, like, 32 gigs or more, it's not really that big of a deal if things just sit around and don't get killed until your system turns off. Or the user will have plenty of time to manually kill the application before it becomes an actual problem. Now, on a low memory system, a malfunctioning OOM where it's just randomly killing applications is better than no OOM whatsoever, because when your system runs out of memory and the system has no way to recover from this state, basically it's gonna freeze or maybe crash. This can be avoided with user intervention before it gets to 100% usage, but if you don't deal with it then, without any way to clean that up, there's just nothing that can be done. So we've established that some level of OOM is probably going to be really useful, especially if you have a low memory system. But Linux distros don't have this reputation of apps just randomly dying. If they did, you would have heard about it before now, and the people who irrationally hate Linux will be talking about it every second of every day. So clearly something with Ubuntu solution isn't being handled correctly. This problem was first brought up on June 9th over on the Ubuntu bug tracker, with a bug report saying, Systemd OOMD frequently kills Firefox and Visual Studio Code. Since I installed Ubuntu 22.04, Firefox and Visual Studio Code are frequently killed by Systemd OOMD roughly every 2 hours. This person has 8 gigs of RAM, which should be perfectly fine to use Ubuntu, and they make this amusing comment here, did 64 gigs of memory become the minimum requirement to run Ubuntu? And right now, it actually kind of is. You can probably get away with 32 gigs, but if you want to actually be safe and not have Systemd OOMD randomly killing things, 64 is basically where you need to be at. But ignoring the fact that it's randomly killing apps, that's one thing. The other problem is it doesn't tell you it's doing it. So there should be a warning prior to killing apps to give the opportunity to save the app data. There should also be an apology and an explanation after killing the app. And this wouldn't be completely unprecedented. Look at the way that browsers handle tabs that aren't responding. Whether it's Chromium or Firefox, they both do the exact same thing. So if a tab stops responding, the browser is going to kill that tab and say, hey, this tab just is broken. Sorry for this. Would you like to restart it? And things like that. With Systemd OOMD, it just kills stuff. And you might think, oh, I forgot to open that, or it just randomly closed for some reason. And it's just not a great user experience. So, as he says here, the current behavior gives the impression that Ubuntu 22.04 is unreliable and unsafe to use, which is a problem for an LTS release that many people might want to use for a critical production context. Visual Studio Code does a lot of autosaving, but let's say you're working on something in Kdenlive, and you leave it, I don't know, you want to go have some lunch, or you have to go to the shops or whatever, you come back, and then the project is just gone. Or you're writing an essay in LibreOffice Writer, and it's just gone. Like, that's just not something that especially an LTS release should be doing, but Linux in general should be doing. One of the key contributors to this problem, but not the only contributor, is Ubuntu swap size. So by default, it is only slightly better than no swap. It is 1 gigabyte. And the only reason it's 1 gigabyte is because some applications expect there to be some level of swap, even if it's a small amount. So having that there is going to make those applications perform correctly, but 1 gigabyte is basically nothing. Sure, if you have like 4 gigs of memory, it's, you know, a quarter of that size, but anything above that, it becomes less and less meaningful. There was a relatively long discussion over on the Ubuntu mailing list on how this problem could be addressed. I'm not going to bore you with the whole discussion. I will leave it linked in the description down below, and I recommend you read it for yourself. But what I want to focus on is the potential solutions that could possibly fix this problem. Firstly, increase the swap use limit. This is basically the threshold before the OOM starts doing anything. Right now at 90%. I don't think this would have any effect whatsoever. And as he says here, it is not clear to me how significant of an impact this would actually have. Going from 90 to, let's say, even 99.99%, that's only like an extra 100 megabytes. And if you're already hitting 90%, you're probably going to hit 99%. It would slightly delay the problem, but I really doubt that it would fix it. Secondly, set managed OOM swap more selectively. We currently follow the recommendation of setting managed OOM swap equals kill. Basically what this means is everything on the system, with the exception of, you know, the kernel and systemd, things like that, is a candidate for being taken down by the OOM. Whether it's a browser, whether it's a text editor, whether it's even the Gnome shell. If it is taking too much memory, the OOM might just strike it down. This is not great. It's great if you don't really care about what is being killed. But there's a lot of applications on your system which should never be touched. The Gnome shell being one of the major ones. The issue here is you either set it so it doesn't touch anything opened by the user, but these are all the applications that are actually using up a lot of memory, basically defeating the point of the OOM, or you go and set the OOM to be very selective, and you pick and choose what applications should be removed. This is not scalable though, because the more applications on your system, the more complex this gets, and doing this in a generic way where it applies to every user on Ubuntu just isn't possible. But let's say you manage to do that. If it is misconfigured in any way, it might start taking down other processes which still cause a lot of damage, but is done so in a more silent way. Let's say the most it can do is take down your desktop portals, for example, and completely break Wayland. The third option is basically don't do swap killing whatsoever. If the swap fills up, that's fine, just worry about physical memory. Because even if you have your swap filled up, it doesn't necessarily mean that you've used up all your physical memory, so your system is still going to operate perfectly fine. The apps that rely on swap may not work as well as they should be, but most of the rest of your system is going to be good. That, I think, might be the best possible solution, at least for now. But I'll get into why it may not be a bit later. And the final option, which is probably the option that I would try first, is increase the swap size on Ubuntu. He says, I'm adding this for completeness, but I don't think this is a viable option. I think this is really the only option that you can do right now besides just disabling swap killing. The reason why he says this isn't viable is because when you update Ubuntu, they don't have a facility in place to resize your swap. So any of the existing installs of Ubuntu would have to manually resize it, or Canonical would have to make a tool to go and do so to easily do it. I think for future installs, though, changing the default swap size has to be done. Maybe having it be a percentage of your memory, like half or equal or whatever percentage, not just statically being 1, regardless of how much memory you have on your system. One user over on the bug report had a good idea. He thought this whole problem was related to a bug involved in Systemd, where up until version 251, it was calculating memory wrong. It was basing it on mem-free, not mem-available. And mem-free is heavily used for caching, so mem-free is going to frequently run out. Turns out, that wasn't actually a problem with Ubuntu. It is a problem with a base version, but that patch was actually cherry-picked into the version being used on Ubuntu. At this stage, the most definite solution seems to be have a giant swap like 16 or 32 gigs and buy more RAM. But even so, even 32 gigs of RAM is not enough to stop this problem. This guy, 32 gigs of RAM, 15 times killed the Gnome shell. So, it's just not working. So, I actually lied about something. I said this problem was first reported on Ubuntu 22.04. That's not exactly the case. It was first reported on Ubuntu on that version. But this problem's actually been known about for a little bit longer. It was first reported with Fedora a year ago, and it was closed. The problem wasn't fixed. It's been known about for an entire year, and for some reason, with the problem not being fixed, it got merged into the LTS. So, yeah, I'm not sure why. It seems like there's two problems going on here. Firstly, Systemd OOMD is really aggressive with its defaults, and Ubuntu didn't change the defaults and just ran with it, and you get a great user experience like you get now. Now, what's really interesting about this is you might be using Ubuntu right now and not experiencing any problem. If this was affecting every single Ubuntu user, there would be, proverbial riots in the streets. It's not always going to be installed. So Systemd OOMD is a dependency for the Ubuntu desktop and Ubuntu desktop minimal, but it is a recommended dependency and not a required one. So you do not actually need to have it installed. You don't even need to be running it actually. So if you want to just ignore the problem and not buy more RAM and let them deal with it in their own times, go into your terminal and run sudo systemctl mask systemd-oomd, and then the service won't start, and you don't have to deal with it anymore, and things should just go back to working. At this stage, the plan is to fix the problem for the next point release of the LTS, which isn't that far away, and I really hope it's fixed by then. I don't use Ubuntu myself, but I want people on Ubuntu to have a good user experience. And unless you're going to go into your terminal and get rid of the OOMD, right now, a lot of people just aren't having a good experience. So let me know, have you been experiencing this problem yourself and have no idea why it was occurring, or did you already know about the problem with Systemd OOMD? And if you did know about the problem, had you taken any steps to address it on your personal system? I would love to know. So if you like this video, I'm going to go and like the video. If you really like the video and you want to become one of these amazing people over here, go check out my Patreon, subscribe, selling Barrel Pay, linked in the description down below. I've got a podcast called Tech Over Tea. I've got a gaming channel called Brodie Robertson Plays. That's going to be it for me, and I'm out.